one woman, one storm, one cry in the night. What Maggie Langston found buried in the snow wasn't just a baby. It was the spark of a war between silence and love, fear and courage. She had every reason to turn away, but what she chose instead became a legend. Stay with us, because the wind still remembers what she dared to do. The story paints Elias as an idealized hero, but in reality, violent men like that don't just walk away from power with a warning. Real confrontation is rarely that clean or resolved so easily. The wind didn't howl. It screamed, a feral, unearthly sound that clawed at the wooden walls of the cabin like it meant to tear the past apart. It was the kind of night that kept even the bravest creatures buried deep in their dens. Snow didn't fall. It attacked, whirling sideways like shards of shattered glass. The blizzard had swallowed everything: trees, fences, memory itself. And inside a weather-worn cabin tucked near the foot of Glacier National Park, Maggie Langston braced herself for the kind of cold that stole more than warmth. It stole hope. It was almost midnight when she heard it, a sound so thin, so out of place, that for a second she thought it was her imagination. A cry, faint, high-pitched, fragile. Not the moan of shifting rafters or the wind trying on another scream. This was something alive, something human. Maggie sat up straight in her rocker, the half-knit shawl falling to the floor as her heart slammed once, hard against her ribs. Another cry, louder, closer. She didn't think. She moved. There were no lanterns, just instinct. She grabbed her wool coat off the hook by the stove, shoved her feet into snow boots stiff with disuse, and stepped out into a storm that didn't want her to come back. The snow was knee-deep in places, the wind so fierce it bent the bare trees like bones surrendering to gravity. 10 paces from the porch, she could no longer see the cabin, but her ears guided her, toward the paddock, past the broken fence, left, where the land dipped slightly toward the stream, and then she nearly fell over it. A bundle, half buried, wrapped in a red cloth that stood out like blood on bone. She dropped to her knees. The snow was eating it alive. Frost clinging to the edges, cloth soaked through. Tiny limbs stiff with cold, but it moved. A tiny arm jerked. A weak, raspy sound escaped the folds of fabric. It was a baby, barely breathing. Male, maybe 8 months old, with a gash across his temple and skin the color of death. But alive, by the mercy of something greater than logic. Maggie didn't pause. She scooped the child into her arms, cradling him against her chest. His forehead touched the hollow of her throat. He didn't cry again. That scared her more than anything. She ran, back through the snow, through a storm that now howled behind her like it had realized something had been stolen from its grasp. Her fingers burned from the cold, her boots felt like lead, but she didn't stop until the cabin door slammed behind her. Inside, she moved on instinct, unwrapping the cloth, building the fire with shaking hands, placing the baby near the heat but not too close, whispering nonsense just to keep sound in the room. He was barely there, pale lips, shallow breaths, and something else. Something carved and hung around his neck on a leather cord. A talisman. Bone, maybe. With symbols she didn't recognize but felt in her bones. Comanche. Her heart sank. She had grown up with stories, warnings, fear wrapped in polite nods and frontier myths. But she also remembered her late husband, Jacob, trading horses with them once, years before suspicion turned every brown face into a threat. That was before the war, before widows like her were expected to keep their heads down and their eyes closed. Maggie didn't sleep. Not that night. She sat in her mother's old rocker, baby wrapped in wool, fingers on his wrist checking the fading beat that flickered beneath delicate skin. When the fever came, it was quiet at first, barely more than warmth on her collarbone. But it grew, fast, the kind of sick that didn't wait for sunrise. She tore herbs from her drying rack, brewed teas her grandmother once used on her when typhoid swept through Kansas. The fire roared so hot the windows wept condensation, but still the child shivered. She held him tighter, sang lullabies in a voice cracked from years of silence. He whimpered at dawn, just once, a sound so small it nearly broke her. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and whispered, "That's it. That's it, little one. Come on, stay." But even as the sun rose weak behind the snow-blind windows, the questions began to whisper. Where had he come from? Who had left him out there? And more terrifying, who would come looking? Because no one left a Comanche baby behind unless it was the only way to give him a chance, which meant the mother was likely gone. The others, missing, or worse. And Maggie Langston, a woman forgotten by the town, dismissed by the church, and left to the mercy of grief and frozen silence, had just brought a sleeping war between her walls. She looked down at the child, now sleeping in a basket lined with wool and trembling hope. Outside, the storm hadn't eased. Snow beat against the shutters like fists trying to get in. But inside, something else stirred, something old, fierce, maternal. Maggie stood and reached for the iron latch on the front door, not to open it, but to brace it. Because something told her this wasn't the end of the storm, it was the beginning. The snow hadn't melted. It had only sunk, heavy and sullen, like sorrow after a funeral. By morning, the land looked bruised. Trees bowed under thick sheets of ice. The wind had lost its fury, but not its sharpness. It whistled low now, curling through the seams of the cabin like it was searching for something left undone. Inside, Maggie Langston stood by the window, rocking gently with the infant pressed to her chest, and listened, not just to the creaks of wood or the shifting weight of snow, but to the silence, the kind that meant something was coming. She hadn't slept. Her body moved on old muscle memory. Feed the fire, steep the tea, check the baby's breath. His fever had broken just before dawn. He was alive. And for the first time in years, Maggie had something other than her own shadow to keep her company. But that comfort came with a price, because Maggie knew this wasn't over. Something about the weight of that red cloth, the carved bone around the child's neck, the scar on his temple. It all whispered of a world that didn't forgive easily. By mid-morning, the first knock came, not at the door, but at the edge of her world. It was Clyde Marston, her nearest neighbor, a farmer with suspicion in his bones and whiskey in his breath. She saw him riding up through the thin curtain of snow, the way his horse picked its steps like it didn't want to be there. Maggie stepped onto the porch, the baby tucked out of sight in a basket by the stove. "Mornin', Maggie," Clyde said, squinting hard like the wind still stung his eyes. "You all right?" She nodded. "Roof held, woodpile's low, but I'll make do." He didn't smile, just adjusted his hat and peered past her shoulder toward the cabin door. "Someone said they saw tracks, near here, day before the blizzard hit." Maggie didn't blink. "Probably mine. Looked small, lighter than yours, maybe even barefoot." She felt her jaw tighten. "No one's barefoot out here this time of year, Clyde. Not if they mean to survive." Clyde didn't press, but his eyes narrowed, like they'd been trained by a dozen winters to see through lies. He looked toward the tree line, then back at her. "Well, you be careful," he said, after a long silence. "There's been talk about a group of Comanche gone missing. Scouts say they might have passed near the river. Some folks are on edge." Maggie nodded once. "Aren't we always?" He didn't laugh, just tipped his hat and rode off, leaving silence in his wake. She closed the door and leaned against it, her breath catching in her throat. It had started. The watching. That afternoon she swaddled the baby tighter. His fever had faded, but his cries were different now. Not pain, not hunger, fear. He whimpered whenever she stepped too far from the stove. His small fingers clung to her shirt like she was the only steady thing in a world that had already broken him once. Maggie couldn't help but wonder, what had he seen? What did he remember? At dusk, a second visitor arrived. This time, Mary Ann Dunn, the preacher's wife, came with a loaf of molasses bread and a basket of questions dressed up as neighborly concern. "Storm didn't tear your fence?" she asked casually, eyeing the corner where the basket sat beside the fire. "Bent it some," Maggie replied, keeping her tone even. "Nothin' I can't mend." Mary Ann stepped inside uninvited, brushing snow from her shawl. Her gaze wandered, never quite meeting Maggie's eyes. "Strange thing," she said, turning toward the hearth. "A boy at the trading post said he saw someone, dark skin, wrapped in red, headed toward this way just before the snow hit. Thought it was a trick of the light. But now folks are wondering." Maggie's spine straightened, but she kept her voice calm. "Storm brings out shadows. Makes people see ghosts." Mary Ann's eyes narrowed. "Ghosts don't leave footprints." They stood there a long moment. Two women separated by more than suspicion. Maggie could feel it, the weight of judgment already forming. The storm might have passed, but the wind carried whispers now, and those were harder to outrun. "Don't let gossip twist you," Maggie said finally, her voice low but firm. "This house holds peace. Nothing more." Mary Ann didn't reply. She handed over the bread and turned to leave, her eyes lingering on the baby's basket just a second too long. That night, Maggie didn't sleep. She sharpened her old hunting knife, not because she expected a fight, but because fear had a way of creeping in when silence lingered too long. She oiled the rifle, loaded it, and set it on the table beside her. The fire cracked and spit warmth into the room, but outside the night felt different, like the land was listening. And still, she couldn't stop thinking about the child. He didn't belong to her, she knew that, but in his tiny heartbeat she felt something more than responsibility. She felt purpose. For the first time since Jacob passed, since the town forgot her, since her own son died, she hadn't let herself feel anything but survival in years. Now, she was terrified to feel anything else, because somewhere out there someone was watching, and they weren't just coming for a child. They were coming for the woman who dared to keep him. The first sound was not hooves. It was the air itself, changing. Maggie Langston had lived through enough Montana winters to know when something unnatural pressed into the day. There was no breeze, no storm, just a shift. Like the valley itself inhaled and held its breath. She was standing on the porch with the baby in her arms when she felt it. He stirred first. His tiny brow furrowed, as though he sensed something before it arrived. Maggie had just changed his swaddling cloth, laid a cool rag on the fading scar above his temple. His fever had passed, but he hadn't smiled, not once. Even when the sun returned and warmed the windows, he stayed quiet, wide-eyed, watching her with a look too knowing for someone not yet a year old. And now his little hand gripped the collar of her dress, not in fear, but as if to warn her. Then came the sound. Faint at first. A low, rhythmic thunder, distant, measured, not wind, not weather. She stepped off the porch. There, across the snow-covered field where the land rose gently into the ridge, something moved, dark against the white. At first, it looked like a cloud. Then it grew legs, then shape, then silence. Riders, a line of them. Horses blanketed in hide and beads, men dressed in furs and feathers, faces marked with paint, posture proud, straight-backed like oak trees. They did not yell, did not charge. They came like a storm that already knew the ending. There were more than 100. Maggie stood still, the baby pressed to her chest, her breath turning to frost on her lips. The riders stopped 50 yards from her cabin, lined across the ridge like shadows cast at high noon. Then, from the center, one man dismounted. He was tall, braided hair streaked with gray. His face bore the story of survival. Scarred along the jaw, one eye darker than the other. But his steps were not angry. They were careful, intentional. He walked the full distance to her porch without a word, and she didn't run. When he reached the bottom step, he looked up, his gaze steady but not hard. The wind didn't dare move. Even the crows stayed quiet. "You heard him," he said. Maggie nodded slowly. "I did." He was not left to die, he was left to live. My wife, his mother, was wounded. We were ambushed. She made me ride with the others. She stayed behind. Maggie's throat tightened. "And the baby?" She wrapped him in her shawl and laid him at the edge of the storm. She believed someone would hear him. He looked down for a moment, then back at her. "You did." She shifted slightly, adjusting the child. "I didn't know what I was doing. Only that he needed saving." "You saved more than a child." The man stepped forward. She flinched slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. He stopped just short of the step, then reached into the pouch at his side and pulled something out. A stone, flat, oval, polished smooth by river water, painted with a single red line across the center. He held it out. "In our way, this means storm walked," he said. "It means you crossed between worlds and did not turn away." Maggie didn't reach for it right away. She looked down at the baby, still sleeping against her, his tiny breaths warm against her skin. "What's his name?" she asked quietly. "We called him Tiva. It means voice." She nodded, tears threatening but held in place. "You may call him what your heart named him." She took the stone. It was warm from his hand. Heavy, but right. The man did not ask for the child. He didn't even hold out his arms. Instead, he looked again at her. "Will you give him back?" he asked, not demanding, asking. "I don't know how," she replied, her voice breaking for the first time. "I didn't mean to keep him, but I'm not ready to lose him." "You did not keep him," the man said. "You carried him through the storm. That makes you blood." Maggie closed her eyes. The baby stirred. When she opened them, the warrior had stepped back. He turned, raised one hand toward the ridge. From the line of riders, a second figure moved forward. This one, draped in a blue shawl, her long hair unbound, carrying something in her arms. She approached slowly, then stopped beside the man. She held a cradle board, woven leather, adorned with feathers and symbols Maggie didn't recognize but felt deep in her bones. Resting atop it was a necklace, bone and turquoise, polished, sacred. The man took it, stepped forward again. Gently, without asking, he lifted the old necklace from the baby's neck and replaced it with the new one. "I give him a new name," he said, "and I give you one too." Maggie blinked through the tears now sliding freely down her face. "What name?" The man met her eyes. "Mother who hears." And just like that, he turned. The woman in blue nodded once. The baby didn't cry. The riders vanished over the ridge, silent as snow. Maggie stood on the porch long after they were gone. The baby slept, and the valley, for the first time in weeks, felt still. Not empty, Still. The wind changed again, not sharp or howling like it had in the blizzard, but softer now, like a breath released after holding too long. Maggie Langston noticed it first when the air stopped biting, and instead carried the faint scent of pine smoke, fresh earth, and something else. Something older than memory. She opened the door that morning not to weather but to presence. A thin curl of smoke rose from just beyond her field, where no smoke should have been. They had come back, but not all of them. Just a few tents, low to the ground, made of hide and canvas, placed respectfully on the edge of her land. Not hidden, not brazen, simply there. A fire crackled in the center, not roaring, but steady. Maggie didn't need anyone to tell her who it was. She felt it in the soles of her feet. Her heart had known they'd return. That evening, she walked the path toward the small camp with the child in her arms. Now, nearly a year old, heavier, stronger, but just as silent. He clung to her as she approached, but didn't fuss. He seemed to know, too. The woman in the blue shawl met her halfway, smiling with something both kind and knowing. There were no grand greetings, no explanations, just a shared understanding between two women who had once passed a life between them in the cold. Maggie stayed near the fire that first night. The boy curled on her lap while the others around her, 3 women, 2 older men, cooked, repaired hides, whispered in a language she could not speak but somehow still understood. No one asked questions. No one gave commands. She watched, and when they offered her a bowl of stew, she accepted without hesitation. In the following days, a routine took shape. Maggie came at sunrise, helped gather water from the creek, watched the women grind herbs into pastes and powders she'd never seen before. In return, she showed them her own methods, how she used mint and honey to soothe a cough, how she mashed garlic into poultices. The boy, who had once barely made a sound, began to laugh when held by the eldest woman. His feet found the ground, wobbled, then stood. By the 5th day, he walked between them, toddling from fire to tent to Maggie's skirts and back again. And each time he looked at her, his eyes held a quiet recognition. A bond. Not of blood, but of something deeper. Still, Maggie knew the unspoken truth. This could not last. She was not his future. Not in the way they were. One night, she sat beside the fire, the boy asleep against her chest, his breath warm against her collarbone. Across the flames, Chief Econ Redhawk returned. He hadn't come to the smaller camp before. But now, he sat. Not with ceremony, just with intention. He watched her in silence for a long moment, then spoke. "He grows between 2 names," he said. "One given by blood, one given by the storm." Maggie looked down at the boy. "I don't know what to call him anymore," she said honestly. "He comes when I call, but I think he answers to more than my voice." Econ nodded. "He will carry both." She hesitated. "Do you want to take him back now?" The chief shook his head slowly. Not take, only share. A child should never be torn between what he was born from and what he became. Maggie felt tears rising again, but she didn't fight them this time. "I've loved him longer than I meant to," she whispered. "He loved you before he knew the word," Econ said. They fell into quiet again, the fire crackling, night stretching across the hills like a slow tide. Then the woman in the blue shawl approached, holding a pouch. She placed it in Maggie's lap. Inside were seeds, wild tobacco, lavender, sage. "For your garden," the woman said, "so he remembers." Maggie nodded, fingers closing around the pouch like a promise. The next morning, the camp was gone. No farewells, no horses, no footprints. Just smoke fading into the sky, and a stone left on Maggie's porch, carved with two birds flying side by side. And the boy? He stayed, for now. She didn't know how long, but she knew something with certainty. He had two homes now, and maybe, just maybe, so did she. The wind didn't knock this time. It whispered. Maggie Langston was hanging a pot of stew over her hearth when she heard it. Not the sharp cry of winter, not the mournful wail of morning winds, but something else. Something familiar. A stirring. A memory waking up. She turned toward the door before it knocked, heart suddenly rushing like a creek after thaw. And when the sound came, 3 soft taps, deliberate as breath, it felt less like a visitor and more like a question long delayed. She opened the door. He was standing there. Not the infant she had held in trembling arms. Not the unsteady boy who once toddled through snow. He stood on his own now, barefoot, bold-eyed, cheeks dark and round with youth. His braids were tied with red string. His hands gripped a feather carved from wood. And behind him stood the woman in the blue shawl, older, softer, but with that same look of quiet fire. No one spoke. The boy stepped forward. He looked up at Maggie, not with confusion, not even surprise, but certainty. "Ma," he said. And that single word cracked open a silence Maggie hadn't known she'd been living inside for 3 long seasons. She dropped to her knees. He didn't run to her, didn't fling himself forward. He simply placed his small hands on the folds of her dress and leaned in, forehead against her chest. Maggie wrapped her arms around him and wept into the crown of his hair. They stayed 3 days. No one in town knew, no one was told. The woman helped in the kitchen, braided herbs for drying, taught Maggie the names of things she'd never grown. Plants that healed, roots that soothed. The boy slept in his old basket the first night, but by the second he curled on a blanket beside her bed and asked if the fire missed him. On the 3rd night, as the wind turned again, he asked something else. "Did I come from your belly?" Maggie hesitated. The woman looked down. The fire popped softly. "No," Maggie said finally. "You came from someplace else, but that doesn't mean I didn't carry you." The boy nodded, then touched his chest. "Then I have 2 hearts." She smiled through tears. "And 2 homes." In the morning, they left again. The woman lifted him onto the pony, steadied his legs. Maggie didn't ask where they were headed. She didn't need to. The boy turned once, just before the trees swallowed the trail, and tossed something through the air. She caught it. A feather, carved from bone this time, with a twist of red at the tip. He grinned. "I'll bring more." And then he was gone. Spring came hard and sudden after that, like it had been waiting for permission. Maggie's garden flourished, not just with corn and potatoes, but with the wild tobacco seeds they had given her. She burned a bundle each dusk, letting the smoke curl through the rafters like prayer. She didn't speak, just listened. Sometimes the wind carried laughter, sometimes it carried footprints. One afternoon, she found a moccasin on her porch, tiny, embroidered in gold. Inside it, a note scrawled in uneven English. "He speaks your name." Maggie didn't cry this time. She baked 2 loaves of cornbread that Sunday, left one on the stone by the creek as she always had. She didn't wait to see if it disappeared, but it always did. She lived that way for years, not waiting, not forgetting. And when the boy returned again, taller, louder, full of stories she could only half understand, she didn't run to greet him. She just opened the door, and he walked in like he'd never left. When Maggie Langston died many years later, she wasn't buried in the churchyard like the others. They laid her beneath the pines near the creek, under a simple carved stone with just one word: Magister. And some say, on certain evenings when the smoke from the valley curls just right and the birds are quiet, you can hear laughter between the trees, or a whisper in the wind, as if someone still remembers. The legacy of Maggie Langston. Maggie Langston's story isn't just about a baby found in the snow. It's not even solely about survival or the unlikeliest of maternal bonds. It's about what happens when someone forgotten by the world decides to love fiercely anyway. When a woman who has lost nearly everything chooses not to close her heart, but to open it wider. Her tale, sweeping, haunting, and deeply human, is one of the most quietly heroic chapters in the Wild West legends. Maggie's journey begins in isolation. Her husband long gone, her child buried, and her community reduced to whispers and suspicion, she lives alone near Glacier National Park, weathering storms not only in the sky but within her own soul. The night the baby arrives, wrapped in red, nearly frozen, marked with the talisman of Comanche origin, she does what few would have done. She takes him in. That one decision changes everything. Not just for the baby, but for her. What begins as an act of instinct becomes a covenant of love. The boy, later revealed to be named Tiva, Voice, doesn't just find a caretaker. He finds a protector, a mother, and a place to grow strong in the midst of prejudice and fear. As the community begins to suspect what Maggie hides, she doesn't cower. She stands tall, deflecting questions with grace, never surrendering the truth of what she knows. That this child was not abandoned, he was entrusted to her. Visitors come and go, the wind whispers threats, but Maggie's courage grows. And when the boy's people arrive, not with weapons but with reverence, what could have been a confrontation becomes a recognition of kinship. Chief Econ Redhawk, the boy's blood relative, doesn't demand his return. Instead, he honors what Maggie has done. He acknowledges that motherhood isn't just about birth. It's about choosing to stand guard over another's life, even when no one else will. In time, Maggie becomes something rare in that harsh world, a bridge. Between cultures, between generations, between pain and possibility. She learns the Comanche ways, not as an outsider but as family. And they, in return, trust her with traditions, knowledge, and a legacy that grows right alongside the child. Years pass, the boy walks, laughs, speaks, leaves, returns, and always Maggie is there, steady, ready, unchanged in love, though changed in every other way. What makes her story unforgettable is not a single moment of heroism, but a series of quiet, radical choices. She chooses to feel when it would be easier to stay numb. She chooses to believe in goodness even when every knock at the door could bring violence. And most importantly, she chooses to give, not out of pity, but out of purpose. The town may never truly understand what she did, but history does, and in the rustle of wild tobacco, in the shadow of two homes built by hands of different colors, in the stories passed down by a boy with two hearts, Maggie lives on. So what's the lesson for us today? In a world still quick to judge, quick to divide, Maggie reminds us that love doesn't recognize boundaries, that motherhood, compassion, and duty are defined not by law or blood, but by action. We learn that being brave doesn't always mean picking up a gun. It can mean picking up a baby and saying, "You belong here." We learn that silence can be powerful, but when the time comes, so can speaking truth to fear. And we learn that sometimes the most extraordinary lives are led by the people no one expects to be extraordinary. The widow in the cabin, the old woman at the edge of town, the heart that beats for someone else simply because it chooses to. Today, Maggie's story speaks louder than ever. In times of uncertainty, it urges us to care. In moments of division, it calls us to bridge. And in the loneliness so many feel, it whispers, "You are not forgotten. your love still matters. So if her story moved you, if it stirred something fierce and tender in your chest, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Wild West Legends. Support the stories that show us who we can be when the world grows cold. Help us keep telling the forgotten histories of brave hearts and unshakable hope. Because in the Wild West, and in life, it's not always the loudest who change the world. Sometimes it's the one who listens to a cry in the snow and answers. Thank you for being part of this legend. We'll see you next time. Saddle up, stay brave, and keep believing in the power of love that defies every storm.